My name is Vorath Sene, and I have been a weapons instructor at the Calveth Military Academy for 31 years. I have taught Drathian cadets. I have taught Sorelian exchange students. I have even, once, taught a Veth warrior who communicated entirely through clicks and still managed to outperform half my class. I thought I had seen everything this galaxy could throw at me inside a training hall. Then the humans arrived. Specifically, then she arrived. Her name was Mara Voss, 17 years old, according to her enrollment file. Brown hair, pale skin, green eyes, slim build. She had the kind of quiet face that made you think she was always calculating something, always watching, always 2 steps ahead of the conversation you thought you were having with her. Pretty girl, completely unremarkable on paper. On paper. She had been admitted as part of the Interplanetary Youth Exchange Program, a diplomatic initiative that I personally believed was designed by people who had never once stood inside a weapons hall and had certainly never tried to explain blade geometry to a species that had only recently discovered that war was, in fact, not a good time. The program was meant to foster cultural exchange, promote understanding, build galactic unity. All of that wonderful political language that meant absolutely nothing when you were standing in front of a class of young soldiers and trying to teach them not to cut their own fingers off. My academy accepted 3 human cadets per cycle. Mara Voss was the only one placed in advanced practical forging. I did not request this. I was not consulted. I received a data slip one morning that said simply, "Human cadet reassigned to Sena's blade, forging and combat application class. Please accommodate." I stared at that slip for a very long time. Then I went to the hall and taught my class and decided to pretend it had not happened. It happened anyway. She walked in on the first day wearing standard academy uniform, carrying a small bag over one shoulder, and she looked around the forge hall with those green eyes like she was a visitor at a museum who had found the exhibit mildly interesting. My students, 12 Calveth cadets, and 2 Sorelian brothers named Fen and Jorath, stared at her the way you stare at something that does not quite fit the picture. I gave my standard opening address. I explained that the forge hall was a sacred space, not because of any spiritual nonsense, but because the tools inside it were dangerous, and inattention was the fastest route to losing a limb. I told them that by the end of this cycle, each of them would produce a functional blade using the materials provided, would demonstrate knowledge of edge geometry, and would pass a practical combat application test. Mara Voss raised her hand. I looked at her. Yes. What materials will we be using, Instructor Sene? Standard alloy stock. Grade 4, Calveth iron. You will be issued your materials at the start of the EE practical session tomorrow. She nodded. Did not write anything down. Just nodded, like she was filing the information somewhere in the back of her head where she kept things she would need later. I did not think much of it at the time. Tomorrow came. I distributed the alloy stock. Each cadet received a measured bar of grade 4 iron, exactly the same dimensions, exactly the same quality. The assignment was simple. Use the tools in this hall, use the techniques covered in the pre-session materials, and begin shaping a blade. You had 6 sessions to complete a functional weapon. Functional meant it could hold an edge, it could withstand impact, and it could be held safely without injuring the user. That was the minimum. Anything beyond that was graded on a scale. The cadets went to work. Mara Voss stood at her bench, held the iron bar in both hands, turned it over twice, and set it down. Then she reached into her bag. I watched her pull out a bone, a large one. Animal, from the look of it, pale and dense, maybe 30 centimeters long. She set it on the bench beside the iron bar and looked at both of them for a moment like she was comparing fruit at a market stall. I walked over. Cadet Voss. Instructor Sane. That is a bone. Yes. Your assignment requires you to forge a blade from the provided iron stock. She looked up at me. The assignment says produce a functional blade. You said functional means it can hold an edge, withstand impact, and be held safely. Is that correct? I stared at her. Yes, that is correct. It does not specify the material has to be the iron stock. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. She was right. I had said produce a functional blade. I had listed the criteria. I had not, in 31 years of teaching this class, ever once specified the material had to be the issued stock, because in 31 years of teaching this class, not a single cadet had ever needed to be told that. You use the iron. That is what the iron is for. That is why you are given iron. The iron, I said carefully, is the standard material for this exercise. I understand, she said pleasantly, but I brought this from home, and I would like to try working with it. Can I use the iron as well if I need to? You brought that from home, I repeated. Yes. You brought a bone to a blade forging class. I brought a bone to a blade forging class, she confirmed, without even a trace of embarrassment. My student Fenn, one of the Sorelian brothers, had stopped working and was watching this exchange with his mouth slightly open. Jorath was pretending to work, but had turned his head at an angle that made it clear he was listening to every word. I looked at the bone. I looked at Mara Voss. I made a professional decision, which was to let her do whatever she was planning and watch what happened, because I had a feeling that stopping her would only mean I would spend the rest of this cycle wondering. You may use the iron as a supplementary material if needed, I said. Continue. She smiled at me. It was a very small smile, the kind that does not show teeth but somehow still makes you feel like you are slightly behind in a conversation you thought you were leading. I walked back to the front of the hall. The session continued. My Calveth cadets heated their iron, used the hammers and the shaping templates, sweated through the early work of convincing a flat bar of metal to become something that resembled a blade. It is not easy work. Iron is stubborn. It resists. You have to be persistent and precise, or you end up with something that looks like a very expensive mistake. Mara Voss did not heat anything. She worked quietly and carefully at her bench. She had brought, apparently, more than just the bone. She had a small kit of tools, compact and worn-looking, the kind of tools that have been used many times by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. I could not identify all of them. Some of them I had never seen before. She worked with a flat scraping tool first, then something with a small curved edge, and she worked on the bone the way a sculptor works on stone, slow and controlled, removing material in careful passes rather than forcing anything. After the first session, I walked by her bench on the way out. She had shaped one end of the bone into what was clearly going to be a handle. The grip was already ergonomic. You could see it. Even at this early stage, you could see that whoever was going to hold this thing was going to hold it comfortably. I said nothing. The second session, she refined the blade section. She had worked the bone down to a flat, tapering form, and she had begun the edge work. She was using the iron stock, not to forge a blade from it, but to create a makeshift abrasive surface, drawing the bone edge across it at a precise, consistent angle. Over and over. Cadet Jorath finished his rough shaping and came to refill his water cup near her bench. He stopped, stared. "Is that," he said slowly, "a blade?" "Not yet," she said. "But it is going to be a blade. That is the plan." He looked at it for a long moment. "From bone." He went back to his bench and said something quietly to his brother in Cerulean. I did not catch all of it, but I caught the word for interesting, because it is a long word in Cerulean, and he said it very slowly. By the end of the third session, she had a rough blade shape that was genuinely alarming in how competent it looked. The edge was not finished yet, but the form was correct. The taper was smooth and consistent. There was a defined spine. The handle fit the hand in a way that suggested she had thought very carefully about exactly how a hand wraps around a grip and what that means for control and force transfer. I asked her, at the end of that session, where she had learned to do this. She looked at me with those green eyes and said calmly, "My grandfather taught me. He was a survivalist. He believed that if you could not make a tool from what was available, you had no business being anywhere you might need one." I thought about that for a moment. "And the bone," I said. "Where did it come from?" "Wild boar," she said. "I hunted it last summer." I had no response to that. I am not ashamed to admit it. I simply had no response. She packed her tools into her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out of the forge hall like she had just finished a pleasant afternoon of light work. I stood at her bench for a moment after she left and looked at what she had created so far. Looked at it properly, with professional eyes and 31 years of experience. It was good. Not student good, not exchange cadet good. Actually, technically, genuinely good. I had a thought, standing there in the empty forge hall, that I did not particularly want to have, but could not stop. If Mara Voss could do this with a piece of bone she had brought from home after 3 sessions, working with hand tools and improvised abrasives, what was she going to do in the remaining 3 sessions? I turned off the hall lights. I went home. I did not sleep particularly well. Session 4 arrived the way bad news always does. Quietly, without warning, and with absolutely no concern for how prepared you were. I came into the forge hall early that morning. I told myself it was because I had administrative work to review. I told myself this very firmly. I did not admit, even privately, that I had come early because I wanted to see what Mara Voss would do next before the rest of the class arrived, and I had to pretend to be professionally detached about it. She was already there. She had arrived before me. She was sitting at her bench in the empty hall, working by the low ambient light of the overhead strips, running a thin, flat tool along the edge of the bone blade in smooth, unhurried strokes. She did not look up when I entered. She simply kept working, calm as a palm river that has decided exactly where it is going and sees no reason to rush. I set my things down at the instructor desk. I pulled up the session notes. I pretended to read them. I watched her from the corner of my eye for 11 minutes before the other cadets started filing in. By the time the session formally began, she had finished the primary edge. I walked past her bench during the opening check and looked at it without breaking stride. The way you look at something you are trying not to obviously look at. The edge was clean, genuinely clean. She had used the iron stock as an abrasive surface across multiple sessions, working the bone edge at a consistent angle until she had produced something that caught the hall light in a thin, even line from tip to heel. That line told me everything. A consistent reflection along a blade edge means consistent geometry. Consistent geometry means controlled work. Controlled work, at that level, means experience that does not come from a single summer with a grandfather, regardless of how skilled that grandfather may have been. I stopped at the end of her bench on my return pass. "Cadet Voss, how long have you been doing this?" She looked up. "Forging?" "Working with bone, specifically." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which I appreciated. "Since I was 9, she said, My grandfather started me on small pieces first. Rabbit bone, bird bone, built up from there. 8 years, I said. Yes. I nodded and walked away, before my expression could say something my professional standing would regret. 8 years. She had 8 years of bone-working experience and had walked into my advanced forging class and said nothing about it. Just sat down, pulled a bone out of a bag, and quietly proceeded to embarrass every assumption I had made about what a human cadet could produce in this environment. The rest of the session was, technically, about my other students. Cadet Lina Rove, my sharpest Calveth student, was doing excellent work with her iron blade. Clean lines, good weight distribution. She had a feel for the material that most cadets did not develop until their second cycle. The Sorelian brothers, Fen and Jorath, were competent and consistent. The remaining cadets were progressing at expected rates. All of that was professionally satisfying. None of it was what the hall was watching. By mid-session, 3 cadets had stopped their own work under the pretense of needing water. A tool from the rack. A question answered. Anything that gave them a reason to walk past Mara Voss's bench and look at what she was doing. Jorath had made that walk twice. His brother Fen had made it once, and then come back for a second look, by pretending he had forgotten his question the first time. It was not convincing. Nobody said anything. She was now fitting the handle. She had carved a shallow grip section into the bone itself, subtle grooves that followed the natural curve a hand makes when it closes around something. Then she had taken a strip of material from her bag, dark and slightly textured, and was wrapping the handle in a specific pattern that I recognized after a moment as a technique for maximizing grip without increasing diameter. It was a technique used by certain combat-focused species on the Outer Rim worlds. It was not, to my knowledge, a technique with any history on Earth. I walked over. "What is that wrapping?" I asked. "Rawhide," she said. "Treated and dried. I prepared it before coming." "The technique," I said. "The pattern. Where did you learn it?" She paused her work for just a moment. "I read a lot," she said. That was it. I read a lot. As if that explained everything. As if sitting in a library somewhere on that small blue planet and reading about alien blade-wrapping traditions and then traveling across the galaxy to a military academy and quietly applying that knowledge in a weapons class was a perfectly ordinary sequence of events that required no further explanation. I walked back to my desk. I sat down. I looked at my session notes and did not read a single word of them. Session 5 was the sharpening and finishing session. Every cadet was expected to bring their blade to a functional edge and complete any final structural work. This was usually where you discovered which students had been rushing and which had been patient, because rushed work in the early stages creates problems that no amount of finishing can fully correct. Lina Rove's blade was excellent. She had done everything right, and she knew it, which gave her a quiet confidence that was good to see in a young soldier. Mara Voss's blade needed almost no finishing. She spent the first portion of the session doing final edge refinement, working through progressively finer abrasive surfaces she had brought herself, because, of course, she had. And the rest of the time she sat and examined the finished piece from different angles, turning it slowly in her hands, checking the balance, checking the flex in the spine, checking the grip under different hand positions. Then she set it on the bench and looked at it. I looked at it from across the hall. It was not a perfect blade. I want to be accurate here. The surface finish had the texture of bone rather than the smooth face of worked metal, and the weight was different from what my curriculum was designed to teach. It was lighter than a standard iron blade of comparable size, which changed the handling characteristics significantly. But it was sharp, It was balanced. The grip was correct. The edge geometry was consistent from end to end. The spine had enough thickness to absorb impact without fracturing. By every criterion I had given on the first day of class, it was a functional blade. More than functional. Session 6 was the practical combat application test. Each cadet had to demonstrate basic strike patterns, blocking capability, and control against a padded resistance target. I was testing whether the blade could perform and whether the cadet could use it effectively. I had been thinking about this test for 3 sessions. The problem was straightforward and also somewhat funny, if you had the right kind of sense of humor, which I was not sure I did at this moment. The test was designed around iron blades. Iron blades have specific weight profiles, specific flex characteristics, specific behavior under impact. My scoring rubrics were built around those characteristics. A bone blade was going to behave differently, which meant I could not simply apply the standard scoring without first understanding what I was actually watching. I called Mara Voss to test last. The other cadets performed well. Lina was excellent, as expected. The Sorelian brothers were solid. One cadet in the middle of the group had a blade with a slight warp that I was going to have a conversation with him about, but he passed. Then Mara Voss stepped up to the resistance target. The hall went quiet in the specific way halls go quiet when everyone wants to watch something, but also wants to look like they are not watching it. She held the bone blade at a low, ready position. Relaxed grip. Weight slightly forward. She looked at the target with that same calm museum visitor expression she had walked in with on the first day. Like everything around her was mildly interesting, and she was deciding what to look at next. She moved. I have been in this hall for 31 years. I have watched thousands of cadets run this test. I know what student movement looks like, and I know what trained movement looks like, and I know the difference between someone who has practiced a technique and someone who has made a technique part of how their body thinks. Mara Voss moved like the second one. The strike patterns were clean and economical, no wasted motion. Each movement connected to the next without pause or reset, flowing from one position to another like she was not executing a test sequence, but simply moving through a problem she had already solved. The blade hit the resistance target with controlled precision, not wild force, and she adjusted her angle between strikes in a way that told me she was actually thinking about what she was cutting, not just performing a memorized routine. When she finished, she stepped back, lowered the blade, and waited. The hall was completely silent. Jorath said, quietly, in Sorelian, a word I understood perfectly, because it is the same in every language and every species figures it out eventually. I cleared my throat. I wrote in my scoring file for exactly 30 seconds, during which time I was mostly thinking rather than writing, and then I looked up. Cadet Voss, I said. Instructor Sane. Your blade passes all functional criteria. She nodded. Your technique, I said, is beyond what this course tests. She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they are not sure if they are receiving a compliment or a criticism and are waiting to find out. That is an observation, I said, not a complaint. You will receive a distinction mark. She smiled, still small, still without showing teeth, still somehow making me feel like she had known this outcome before she ever walked into this hall. Thank you, Instructor Sane. Where did you learn to move like that? I asked. It was not a professional question. It was just a question. I was past pretending I was not curious. She considered it for a moment. Same place I learned most things, she said. My grandfather believed that a tool without a user who understood it was just an interesting object. He taught me to make the blade, and use the blade at the same time. He said you could not really understand one without the other. I wrote that down. Not in the scoring file. In a separate note I keep for things I want to remember. The class was dismissed. The cadets filed out. Most of them went in the direction Mara Voss had gone, and I strongly suspected that was not a coincidence. Jorath had a question ready. Fen had probably too. I stood at her bench for the last time and looked at the bone blade, which she had left on the surface while she packed her tools. She came back for it, picked it up, wrapped it carefully in a cloth from her bag, and placed it inside. "Cadet Voss," I said. "Yes?" "Next cycle," I said. "I am adding bone working to the curriculum, as an optional module." She looked at me for a moment, then that small smile again. "I would be happy to assist, if you want." I thought about that. A 17-year-old human girl, with green eyes and 8 years of bone-working experience, and a grandfather who hunted boar and read about alien blade techniques, standing at the front of my forge hall and teaching my cadets something I had not thought to teach them. "I will consider it," I said. She nodded, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked out. I stood in the empty hall for a while. 31 years of instruction and the most technically confident display I had seen in a practical test came from a human girl who had walked in carrying a bone in a bag, told me she read a lot, and then quietly produced a weapon that my curriculum had no category for. I turned off the lights. I went home. This time, I slept fine. Because somewhere between Session 1 and Session 6, I had stopped being surprised and started being, in the very specific way that only the best students ever managed to produce, genuinely impressive.